I realized that the elements that we as a network offered were insufficient, to be honest. We really focused on the programmatic side and on the faculty professional development side. And I started to realize that the whole DEI issue was a lot deeper, because essentially it was attacking what I call the invisible curriculum in schools. The curriculum that is essentially the operating system for your community. And so it touches not just the faculty professional development, but it touches everything that you do. And it touches the student experience, etc. So I started talking to a number of leaders, and I got various different comments. And that's what led us to this situation. And I'll give you some examples of some of the comments that I got. And I think the survey results we will see will bear those out. One of the comments was, we really don't have the budget to do this work. The budgets are very, very constrained. We don't know what the enrollment picture is looking like. And it's a budget that really has to touch not just on faculty, as I said, but on parents, on the board, on students, on every part of it. And that was one very loud message. A second message for the schools that had started on this path earlier, that I started to get from in certain corners, was we have started at the wrong place. And I think what they meant by that mostly was that they had started at the place of, we can attack this through professional development and recruitment. And so many people had gone down the road of saying, look, we're going to hire someone to actually lead this effort and bring someone in from the outside. And sometimes that person, not always, but sometimes that person was not given enough support, or came in with all kinds of things that were really a little bit alien to the community, but probably fundamental to the future. And so that presented some problems that needed to be addressed. Some schools said to me that they found that the families were starting to feel like they're making a choice between their values and what the school offers. And that presented an enrollment problem for them. So there's a whole host of issues that essentially started to bubble up. And what I realized also was that we as a national association needed to bring something different to the table. We really needed to build a kind of consultant ecosystem that could support the schools at different levels of the spectrum. So support the schools that didn't have the budget to have a particular person, support the schools that did have a budget to have consultants and others, because many schools were saying also to me, and I forgot to say this, that sometimes they'd start with recruiting a person, and then they'd find that the consultant budget had more than doubled those costs. So we had to find a kind of consultant ecosystem that could be deployed, but the consultant ecosystem had to be different, because it couldn't be the kind of situations that had been used for professional development, where you'd bring in an institute for a particular kind of pedagogical element, have a workshop, tell the faculty what to do, and then basically they'd never be seen again. This was a ecosystem that needed to be a kind of long-term one, budgetary-wise, because you didn't want to be bringing the consultants or the other resources up to speed every time you hired someone new. So we needed a kind of longer type of system. And that's when I turned to Josh and Anabel and others, and I said to them, look, you guys have a very large network here. You've done this kind of work. You've seen the range of stuff that takes place, from awareness to readiness and capacity building, and then ultimately to implementation and transformation. Can you help us kind of forecast what that would look like in terms of activities and in terms of actual dollars? And that's what brings us to where we are today. And I hope all of you have completed this survey, and I'm going to refresh it right now and see whether hopefully we've got a good participation. And Josh, perhaps you can comment on some of these results. We have 38 people who have participated. It's not bad. 42% heads of school, 16% division heads. So the first question is, how do you regard the leadership responsibilities around DEI SEL at your school? And here are the results.
Well, let's talk about that one for a second, Sanje. 1/5, there's nobody really taking responsibility for that. Slightly more than the responsibility of like somebody leading it, or that it's systemic. And I think, Sanje, you use this term invisible curriculum, and Anabel is talking about this light that we want to be in our schools. Michael and Cherilyn and Carolyn, Sanje and Anabel and I have talked about what we've heard from a lot of schools in this challenge. And I think depending on where you are in the process, the answer to this question is essential. That ultimately for transformation to occur, we really need to be in that systemic category. And probably most schools start with it in the ad hoc and then move into it being one leader's role, and then finding that's not enough. And so then they say, well, let's make this part of lots of leaders' roles. And then how do we really make it systemic? Michael, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, Josh, thank you. I appreciate that. Just coming from the DEI perspective and thinking about leadership, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that DEI is really the role of everyone. And I think institutions have gotten really good at saying it's everyone's role, but not everyone knows what to do. And if there was a question a little bit earlier about who is driving it, and even you see the lack of, or the small number of DEI professionals who are part of the conversation. And so I think as we're thinking about DEI, SEL, and budgets, how do we begin to nurture key leaders, but also all leaders? And in order to do that, instead of going quickly, we're going to really have to go systemically. And so I think part of the system is really thinking about how do we as leaders find out where we are, not about issues of race or gender, but systemic management of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe that a lot of the work that I've been doing is to say, how do we connect DEI to the bottom line? And so if we are working in admissions, DEI is there. If we're working in the food services, DEI is there. If we're working in your area of your recruitment, it's all there, but we have to strategically think about that. So just looking at the numbers and also the folks on the line, helping us to think of it as in a holistic way that doesn't cause us to go slowly, but it causes us to go together.
Let's move on to the second question. Based on your experience, in which stage of development is your school in creating community-wide inclusion?
And I think this really speaks for itself. We're in a wide range of stages, and the ability to figure out where you are and then to design your solution and budget based on where you are. And if schools try to do transformation and they're not in the transformation stage, they're going to get into some real challenges. So really looking at where you are and having some data around that, and then making a plan to go through that stage and into the next stage is, I think, going to be one of the important choices here.
Okay. Next question. Who is driving the imperative for DEI SEL implementation most at your school?
Michael, you start.
I'll just chime in for a moment. Just even as we look at in our collaborative, as we're working together, you will notice that you don't see a DEI officer there, right? And so maybe there would have been folks who would have answered that, but they're not having someone who does the work or who is trained in the work to be in the room is not there. So therefore, it can be very challenging. And then we see the faculty are leading, which is nothing wrong with that. However, they have two jobs. They're educating students and creating policies and practices. So it may be misaligned. That's some of my early observations, Josh.
Cherilyn, you are in our board category for a school as a person leading a committee in a private school board for Jedi. What do you make of this graph?
Well, I think 40% from the board leadership is a good sign. I think that's actually higher than I expected to see on this call. So it means that we're not alone as a school for having prioritized it, also from not just faculty and through integration, but also from the board level top down, and meeting in the middle together and having collaborations, considering bringing in consultants that work in all of the spaces so that the board initiatives and the faculty initiatives and the student initiatives are all working toward the same strategic plan.
So we didn't ask this question on the survey, but I think Cherilyn just hinted at a crucial question, which is, this question is who's driving it, but the kind of counter question is who's on board with it. And perhaps one of the most important parts of this process, as we think about it from a strategic change initiative, will be that all of these constituent groups in some way have to become aligned.
I would just like to make a comment about the parents. I'm interested in the fact that the parent representation is so low. In the end, organizations, schools get their money from the parents and the donations. We've got to find some ways to up that level of involvement.
Josh,
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing this. I've been hearing this from many schools that the parent issue is one of the big ones, because basically, with all this work, it's kind of diverting from what they see as the main curriculum, and they feel like they're being forced to do this. And at some point, what about the grades and what about everything else? And let's go back to the main reason that we're paying our money here, which is X, Y, and Z, right? And so I'm not surprised by this parent piece at all. I think the other piece with this faculty piece is that it's showing me that the programmatic side, which is basically what we've been focused on, is only a piece, which is basically what I was saying in the beginning, and all the other pieces have to be brought into the budget. This is we're getting to the end. To what degree could or has a DEI and SEL focus created divisions in the school before unifying it? Fascinated by this question.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see the answers on this. In our informal conversations with school leaders, we've heard many people in the polarizing category. And so I was interested to see that polarizing was actually relatively small. But tension is clearly big. And of course, these are incredibly difficult issues. When we confront the reality of the systemic racism that our schools are operating in and often perpetuating, when we look at the level of patriarchy, when we look at the way that our schools have power distancing and social structures that drive people apart, when we have even SEL programs that are really policing programs instead of relationship building programs, we have a lot of deep issues. I think the challenge is, who do we want to be as schools? What is our mission? How are we going to differentiate? And to be relevant, to be effective, how do we bring people together towards that goal? And it's fine if there's tension and even polarization along the way, if we're ready for that. But I think when we don't have that clear why and the alignment of these stakeholder groups around that why, the tension and polarization becomes a roadblock. And basically, I'd summarize that by saying, as you think about change, are you thinking about it as this linear process of like, oh, we're here, we're going to make a plan, we're going to go through the change process, and then we're going to be done? Because if that's your vision of change, you're going to be sadly disappointed when you get into the reality and you start finding that change is actually quite chaotic, quite complicated. Probably you've all seen on social media that meme of, how I thought my life would go. And it's like this nice upward arrow, and how it actually went. And it's like this tangled ball of thread. And I think as we think about this from a strategic perspective, being ready for that tangled ball of thread and building the structure, building the capacity, building the alignment to go through that process.
And what is your annual DEI budget for school, including personnel, stipends, consultants, but excluding financial aid? Yes, exactly. Exactly what I thought.
I'm not surprised to see this. I think, given over half of this, our population here on the webinar is still in the assessing their own readiness phase, this would not be surprising that the budget threads are aligned. I noticed a lovely comment here also about SEL and trauma-informed work, how they're all connected. And that's essentially what we're saying, is that if you try to silo an SEL program just to the counseling office, it's not going to be effective. If you try to silo the DEI program just to the DEI office, it's not going to be effective. So what we're talking about is a holistic change with a continuous cycle of improvement. And what that looks like is, as we discussed, a threaded institutional budget, which is also reflective of the values of your organization and how that's aligned with your long-term strategic plan.
Are seeing it's important that we develop clarity about how this culture building work is part of the mission. And therefore, one of the first foundations is going to be to make a plan, a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, and really figure out, how does doing this work help us advance us at our strategic goals? The second issue we're seeing is, how do we come together and build alignment in this work? And so once we have that plan, how do we engage people in it? And then, and really, I would say only then, do we actually start to work on implementing the plan and saying, let's build capacity. And let's not think about capacity as one officer and saying, oh, you now are going to fix this culture or do all this work, but saying, how do we build capacity across the institution? So we have a little bit of a framework that we have started to work on. And we can, any of you who would like to have a one-to-one with the team to talk about these needs in a more detailed way, we're happy to share this template with you and go through it. And I think, Sanje, we've already shared the sort of macro view with your members. And so there's a brochure.
I'm not sure how many of them would have focused on it in the last, we only did this in the last month over the Christmas time period. So it's worth sharing, going through it a little bit.
Would you drop that in the chat, Carol or Sanjay? And then what I'll share on my screen is very similar to what we will, this sort of, I don't know if brochure is the right word, but thinking piece that we've shared about how you might consider doing this work. What you can see on the screen here is those 4 levels that we put into the survey. And are you working on getting buy-in? Are you really setting up the conditions? Is your focus on building the capabilities that you're going to need for that shift? Are you actually in that place of weaving it into everything you do, or making it part of the day-to-day? And as we started to think about what we had seen in the data previous to today, and it really fits with today's data, where schools are in terms of spending on this, we identified that these are sort of target ranges of what we think most private schools will be thinking about in these different areas. Now, of course, it's quite different if you're in, New York or in San Francisco compared to many other places in the country, just because of costs there. And this is one of the challenges, of course, is that it's really hard to get really good people and keep really good people in this competitive landscape. And that's one of the challenges we've heard. A kind of key point here is we have had some people say to us, well, I want somebody else to do this work. And part of that work can be done without a lot of involvement from the leadership. But when you're talking about really building capacity and moving into transformation, it becomes more and more central to the head and senior leaders and the board and the staff. It becomes something as you move over into years 3 and 4, we're really talking about this is everyone's work. But you don't have to start there. And you can start, as you're in these columns, thinking about who are some stakeholders and constituents who can build that. How do you start building a committee or affinity groups or leadership groups within your institution that are going to carry that work? And then based on where you are, what kinds of support might you need? And from those supporters, whether it's an external consultant or a consultant that's really assigned to you, or kind of external internal partner, or somebody who's really in-house driving, or even a whole team driving, what might they be doing? And so I'm not going to go through every line because I think that will be boring, but to say there's a number of dimensions of what that might look like. And this chart is in that PDF that we can share with you. What's not in that PDF, which I think we want to zoom into here a little bit, is what does that look like from a budgetary perspective? But before I go to that budget sheet, let's just see if anybody else on the team wants to highlight anything on this sheet, or if any of you in the chat are looking at something on this sheet and saying, wait, what is that? What does that mean? I'm curious about that. Feel free to pop into the chat a question at this stage. So anybody want to highlight anything on here?
To me, Josh, the beginning data and the dashboard that ultimately is used to evaluate success has to be a significant portion of this, because if we don't have a data-driven approach to this, then it becomes very loosey-goosey, and people will not really have a way of evaluating whether this is a fundamental piece of the program. And that's kind of part of the reason why we've been stressing the importance of things like assessment at a student level, as well as in the other constituencies, and an assessment framework that is particularly competency-based and that can look at some of the non-cognitive competencies that are kind of enmeshed in this whole area. Does that make sense?
And that's exactly where we see this alignment of SEL and DEI work. It's about the relational capabilities and the culture that we're building. So just for example, we measure trust in schools, and it's really hard. You're going to fall right into that polarization place if trust is low and you try to go too fast. So getting that baseline data of individual capability, student capability, and the culture is going to be essential in making a plan that's actually going to work.
I would add to that baseline data that you need also record keeping system. I was just meeting with a group last night which expressed the frustration that someone would come along in the school and champion this and it would move forward. And then that person would move on, and then all of the data was stored in their head and they couldn't remember, well, did we do this? Did we do that? Did we didn't do this? So data and records, journal keeping are critical as well.
Institutional knowledge as opposed to individual knowledge. And that goes with that theme that we talked about really, as you move towards the right here, you're moving towards this being more and more an organizational responsibility, not an individual one. Michael?
Yeah, and I think just to that whole point, a lot of schools have gone down the let's hire the director of community engagement, or SEL or DR, whatever the title is. And then they have to go back and try and fill in these 3 columns that they don't have much visibility on.
Yeah, I was just going to thank you, Sanje, for saying that. Looking at the different aspects of what schools are looking for, it really helps to lay out a framework for what the school needs to do. It's not the work that a person needs to do, particularly if you hire someone who doesn't have that formalized training. So to have this kind of model where on the front end, you see this is the work, beginning to think strategically about who are the people in the school that can do that and who are the partners that can help to really build that foundation. Because again, when we're talking about DEI and SEL, it really needs to be wrapped around and into the institution. And that's not a person. And then part B of that is what Anabel talked about, really stressing to schools that you want your DEI officer or whoever, in terms of keeping records, to make sure that you have a central location beyond your diversity officer, because what happens too often is that your diversity officer leaves and everything that's been curated is now going with them. I think that's a part of that, that's fine, but the school has to really tend and take care of that work, because it ends up being a cyclical system where we lose resources and time when we don't do that.
Well, Michael, one of the other problems is that there's an attitude that basically the survey data that goes with the community section of accreditation is sufficient as a record keeping. And obviously that's not the case, because the community section of an accreditation protocol is usually not integrated with all the other pieces, and the data doesn't flow in all directions. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, before we go on, I want to just mention something about the relational component of this. As a CEO, I'm not a school head, but as a CEO, I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility around this work in my organization. And one of the things that has been very painful in this, particularly in this last year, with the uprising following George Floyd's murder, and just the attention that's come to this space, I see a lot of us white folks saying, I want to do this work. I want to, this is not who I want to be. This is not who I want us to be, but I don't know how. And I don't have allies. And so as we're talking about this, I just don't want to forget, like, this sounds very like logical and a little bit transactional, but fundamentally we're talking about a relational problem. And in this relational problem, if you as a head, as you as a school leader, if you do not feel allyship and you do not feel yourself in allyship, it's going to be really hard to do this work. So how do we build that relationship support where you have somebody in your corner and you are in their corner, and together you're going to be champions of this culture change? And I would say that is going to be the what makes or breaks this process. Let's go to our other spreadsheet and get into a little more detail on budgeting, going from the macro to the micro here, just to give you a sense as you're thinking about these different dimensions. If you were going to be spending, so this is in the column of capacity building. So if you're going to be spending 75 to 100K, these are some of the things that we would think about prioritizing. Now, as I said, any of you is welcome to sign up with Carol, and she'll schedule a one-to-one session with you and some of us to really go through this and think with you about where you are and what your needs are. And we can share this template and other templates with you to help you take some next steps. But just at a high level, as you think about, these are the same things you saw on the first sheet. It's just organized a little bit differently here. And to say, absolutely first thing we're going to say is, if you don't have good data, let's get the data. And depending on where you are in this process, now remember, we're over in the capacity in this example. For capacity building, we need to measure people's capacities. We need to measure how much skill they have in this cultural competence work, in the social emotional work, in this culture change work. How much readiness do they have for that as individuals, and how much collectively? And this isn't necessarily a full DEI audit. Obviously, like really doing an audit is going to move you way over past this $75,000 budget. Getting focused on this year plan. The 3-year plan at this capacity building stage is quite important because we need to get alignment, and we need to figure out how this kind of data is part of your strategic plan. And then in the leadership and board, either together with your partners from whoever's doing this work with you, to make sure that you're building in time to build this alignment with the school leadership and the board or board committee, unless the head is doing that, with faculty, and then with your DEI SEL culture committee. And so these are approximate hours in a year. And this adds up, these hours add up to about a half time, having a seconded consultant, specialized consultant who already has deep expertise, being able to jump into action